Okay, so our first case takes us to South Africa in 1906. It's the story of Clara Germana Cele, a 16-year-old orphan who reportedly confessed to making a pact with Satan. What happened next would become one of the most witnessed paranormal events in history.
And get this, the details that were documented by the people there are just mind-blowing. More than 170 witnesses, that's a lot of people, swore they saw Clara exhibit what they could only describe as superhuman strength, speak languages she'd never known, and most incredibly, they say she levitated 5 feet off the ground. These accounts, you have to remember, were recorded decades before modern psychiatry could offer any other kind of explanation. They just describe a scene of pure terror.
Now, Clara actually survived the 2-day ordeal, but the tragedy here was the sheer psychological trauma of it all. Her story became this foundational example of a successful exorcism, and it set a really chilling precedent for what people thought the battle against demonic possession was supposed to look like.
All right, let's jump forward a few decades to 1949, to a case in the United States that would eventually worm its way right into the heart of modern pop culture. This is the story of a 14-year-old boy who we only know by the pseudonym Roland Doe.
So, the story goes, it all kicked off after he used a Ouija board. Pretty soon, his family started reporting this terrifying poltergeist activity. Furniture moving on its own, objects just flying through the air. But the most disturbing part, which was documented in these secret church diaries, was that words like evil and hell literally started appearing as deep scratches on the boy's skin. This led to weeks and weeks of intense, violent exorcism rituals.
You just can't overstate the impact of this case. The boy's profound trauma and the documented horror of his exorcism became the direct inspiration for The Exorcist, which is, let's be honest, arguably the most terrifying film of all time. So the tragedy wasn't just his ordeal, it was how that ordeal was then transformed into a global, cultural nightmare.
Now we're going to jump to the 1970s, a decade that saw two particularly brutal cases. First, over in the UK, we have Michael Taylor, a man whose exorcism had an immediate and horrifically violent aftermath. Get this, priests worked on Michael for over 24 hours straight. During this grueling marathon session, they claimed to have cast out an astonishing 40 demons from his body. 40. They believed they had won, but they were wrong. As they sent an absolutely exhausted Michael home, the priests gave him this bone-chilling warning. They told him that while they'd gotten rid of dozens of demons, they had failed to vanquish one last, incredibly dangerous entity, the demon of murder.
And just hours after getting home, Michael Taylor did exactly that. He viciously murdered his wife and their dog. The ritual didn't save him. It seems like it just unleashed the very violence it was supposed to contain. So with Michael Taylor, you see how the violence just exploded outward. But only 2 years later in Germany, a similar ritual led to a tragedy, where the violence turned fatally inward, into a kind of self-destruction.
And that brings us to the case of Anneliese Michel, a young German woman whose story is so horrific, it became the basis for the film The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Her ordeal really represents this terrifying collision between faith and medicine. 67. Let that sink in for a second. That's how many exorcism sessions Anneliese was subjected to in just 10 months. This wasn't a one-time event. This was a prolonged, systematic ordeal that completely took over her life.
And here's the absolute crucial detail. Doctors had already diagnosed Anneliese with epileptic psychosis. Now, this is a condition that can cause severe hallucinations, delusions, really erratic behavior, symptoms that to her deeply religious family looked exactly like demonic possession. Convinced she was possessed by multiple demons, including Lucifer, Cain, and Judas, they watched as she did these horrifying things, producing guttural voices that were actually captured on audio recordings that are still just deeply disturbing to listen to.
But in the end, Anneliese Michel wasn't killed by a demon. She weighed only 68 pounds when she died from severe malnutrition and dehydration. The cause of death was neglect. In the aftermath, her parents and the 2 priests were actually found guilty of negligent homicide. It was a landmark case that held exorcists legally responsible for a death.
And this tragic pattern, it doesn't just stop in the 70s. It continues right into our own century. In 2003, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the story of 8-year-old Terrence Cottrell gives us maybe the clearest, most heartbreaking example of a medical condition being fatally misunderstood.
Terrence was autistic, and his behaviors, things like rocking, making vocal sounds, resisting being held,
These were all hallmarks of his condition. But to a minister who didn't understand autism, they looked like signs of demons that needed to be cast out. During a so-called prayer service, the minister physically restrained the small boy, lying on top of him to try and control him.
Unable to breathe, Terence Cottrell died of asphyxiation during the ritual that was meant to save him. There was no supernatural mystery here at all, just a tragic, preventable death caused by a profound and deadly misunderstanding of a recognized medical condition.
So, after hearing all that, it really brings us to the core question of this entire explainer, doesn't it? When we look at these 5 stories all together, are we really seeing evidence of supernatural evil? Or are we just witnessing a pattern of profound human tragedy, fueled by fear and misunderstanding?
I mean, this table really lays it all out. It reveals a clear and, frankly, a really disturbing pattern. The early cases, right, like Clara Soleil and Roland Doe, they're framed entirely by supernatural claims that result in severe trauma. But as we get closer to our own time, diagnosed medical conditions, epileptic psychosis, autism, start to enter the story, and the outcomes become undeniably physical and fatal: murder, death by neglect, death by asphyxiation. So what we're left with are 5 devastating stories. 5 lives that were either lost or forever changed at this fatal intersection of deeply held faith and tragically misunderstood illness. It forces us to ask not only what we believe, but what responsibility comes with those beliefs, especially when a human life is on the line.